Welcome to Charles Dickens, A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hello everyone, today's guest is the BAFTA award-winning actress Miriam Margolyes, whose love of Dickens began at the tender age of 11, a love which she has carried her entire life. I'm not going to say any more by means of introduction because fans of Miriam's solo show, Dickens and Women, will be very excited by what is about to be said in this interview. Miriam, welcome.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very good, Dominic. Nice to see you.
Oh, well, it's lovely to see you. It's lovely to see you through the means of special technology that we have these days. Can you imagine if this pandemic was 30 years ago? What would we have done?
We would have read. We would have read more books, I think.
Yes, and lots of Dickens, I hope.
Definitely. I mean, this is his season anyway, so we would certainly be reading them now.
Yes. You'll be pleased to know that I'm holding in my hand your autobiography. This much is true.
Oh.
You may be less pleased to know that I've ripped off the dust jacket, because I always do that with books. I always like to get hold of the actual book to hold and make notes and everything.
Yes, of course.
So, did I remember right in reading your book that you first picked up a copy of Oliver Twist when you were 11 years old?
Yes, that's right.
How was that? What was that experience for you?
Well, it was, of course, a seminal experience. It was the door that opened. And it was particularly extraordinary for me and bewildering in a way because of Fagin. Because Fagin is a kind of anti-hero of the book, I think. He's a Jew and I'm a Jew, and he's clearly both comic and evil. And that combination of comic and evil is a very Dickensian one. So I didn't know that then because I'd never read anything else. But I kept thinking, he's described all the time as a Jew, slimy Jew, crawling along the pavement, and he was clearly a bad lot. And I thought, well, he's not like any Jew that I've ever known. Why? I wonder, how did that come about? Is that how Jews seem to other people? And it really fixed my imagination. And maybe if I hadn't started with Oliver Twist, I wouldn't have been so wrapped in Dickens for the rest of my life.
Did you find, reading it as an 11-year-old, were you in any way offended by the portrayal of Fagin, or did you just...
Not at all. No, and I'm still not offended by it. No, I was just sucked and dragged willingly into the Dickens world.
Yes.
That pullulating, busy, colourful, sombre world that he creates.
Yes.
And I just couldn't get enough of that book, and I read it, and then I went on to, all the others that I could read, that I could understand at that age. I remember I did read The Tale of Two Cities and Nicholas Nickleby I enjoyed very much. And
Yes.
then I don't think that I read the kind of difficult books till much later on, maybe when I was at university.
Yes, of course, and this is another thing that's not widely known about you, I don't think, in the public eye, is that you went to Cambridge. You went to Newnham College, Cambridge, you read English, and Dickens was your special subject there.
Well, that was a great treat to be able to read him, something I would do for fun and have it part of my studies and count towards my degree. And I was taught by Mrs. Leavis, Queenie Leavis, and by Dr. Leavis, and their influence has never left me. I'm still a Leavisite, as we used to be called in those days. And I'm speaking of, 60, 70 years ago.
So when you were at Cambridge, did you ever imagine yourself wanting at that point to then perform Dickens? Where did that happen for you?
When I was studying Dickens for my special subject at Cambridge, it became clear that many of the characters, and he, as I always tell people, he created over 2,000, more than any other writer in the world, in history. I realized that many of them seemed to have roots in real people that he knew and met and sometimes worked with or lived with or saw in the street. And I thought, gosh, how interesting that he used his life in his work like that. Well, I suppose it's not that unusual. Lots of people do. But it didn't seem to me that that had been pointed out sufficiently by Dickens commentators and professors who study him. And so I thought, gosh, I must go into that a bit. And that was where I think the seeds of the idea of doing a theatre piece that would show off my talents as an actress and at the same time tell the story of the man.
Yes. Yes, I'm very interested to know what you think of the man, because I imagine, Miriam, if I could send you back in time and Dickens was there in front of you, I imagine you going up to him, giving him a hug, and then giving him a slap. Would that be a...
That's a brilliant reconstruction of my first meeting with Charles Dickens. A hug and a slap, and then maybe another hug.
I'd like to think so, yes.
Yes. Well, he was a complicated and I think damaged character. And I think he was damaged by his mother. A lot of my ideas on Dickens came from talking to Professor Michael Slater, who wrote the great book on Dickens and Women. I got to know him and I'm absolutely mad about him. And I take every possibility I can to go and see him and talk to him, because he is a fund of knowledge. And because he's a very human person, he's like Dickens, he's not an academic. You don't feel, oh gosh, this guy knows so much. You just think, oh, he loves it so much. And so I had the idea that I would write something, and I tried many times to do it myself. And there were many half-begun bits of work. But then I met Sonia Fraser, who died 6 years ago and was an actress, with me in radio, where I started.
Yes.
And she listened to me talking about Dickens, and she said, well, I think we should do something here. And I'd worked for her before as an actress, because she directed as well. And so we decided that it was really too big a subject for us, and we would get Olwen Wymark to write a script. And we did. And she delivered the script, and we paid for it. But it wasn't good. It wasn't what we wanted. It didn't have life. And so in the end, we wrote it ourselves. We hadn't meant to, but that's how Dickens Women started.
Yes, and I didn't ever get to see you perform it on stage, but I have listened to the audio version that you recorded, which I think, again, is in front of an audience, and it really captures that live experience. And what I found fascinating, and what I do find fascinating in your portrayal of all characters, actually, not just Dickens, is that when I've seen Dickens adapted, sometimes I see Dickens characters portrayed where everyone is Mr. Bumble, sort of shrieking like a town crier, or it's frothy. Or I see adaptations where it's very dark and it's very serious and down and dismal. Whereas you seem to combine the full scope. So, for example, the poignancy of the Mrs. Micawber moment, which you present, is really very, very deeply moving. I wondered if there was anything you could say about that particular moment in the show.
I'm glad that you think I encompass some of the variety of Dickens, because that's what he offers us all. He offers us all human life. And that's what I wanted to try to show in the evening that we created. But Mrs. Micawber has always been a figure of fun, and I felt that there was more to her than that. And when I just go by the text, and I just read the text over and over, and it seemed to me that here was an incredibly brave woman who was dealing with an impossible man, but loving him nonetheless. And that's what I wanted to show. It always moved audiences whenever I did it. People would always say, oh, I love Mrs. Micawber. I never saw her quite like that. And that was delightful when people say that.
Yes, that's wonderful. And it's delightful to have it completely backed up by what's written itself. It's just that you've illuminated that and you've shed light on that. And I think that's completely right about Dickens. And that's why he's worth staying with us, isn't he? Because of that truth. And you are someone that, you know, reading your book, and I know over the years that I've been aware of you, that you care about truth. You care about not concealing things, not lying, standing up for injustices. All of those things are true Dickensian traits in terms of spirit, anyway, I think. And so...
Well, he was like that, although he was a great liar.
Yes.
I'm not a great liar, but he was. And I go back to what I said about his having been damaged by his mother. The things that happen to us in our childhood do take root in us, all of us. And sometimes we deal with it, or sometimes we hide it and then we have problems with it. But I do think that the early things that happen in our lives have a resonance throughout our lives. And I believe that was the case, certainly with Dickens. He had a problematic relationship with women, and he both loved them and truly loved them, and was also angry with them. I show that, I hope, in the choice of women, of women's characters that I portrayed.
Absolutely. And of course, the one that you say who is strikingly modern is Miss Wade. I was very, very awakened by that reading that you gave of her, because it could even be very easy to read the novel and not really take in what she's actually saying about her life.
I agree. I think a lot of people never did. I mean, I honestly think I was the first person who just said, well, that's a lesbian. What he is describing is an unhappy lesbian affair. He was a journalist, you see, and he never lost that sharp, calculating eye of the journalist. He certainly grew from journalistic prose into some of the most majestic prose that was ever written. He is a great writer. The way he uses words and paragraphs are delicious. I find him, you know, I just go sometimes in the afternoon and take down a book and just open it and just read out aloud some of the paragraphs, because they please me so greatly. But Miss Wade, for example, she starts off her story saying, I have the misfortune of not being a fool. From a very early age, I have detected what those about me thought they hid from me. Now, you wouldn't have thought that that was a Dickens person. That doesn't have any rotundity. It doesn't have any, there's nothing showy about that sentence. It's a cool sentence. And I think it's just an extraordinary and accurate portrait of a woman who is hemmed in. Her real self is hemmed in, and yet she can speak of a most tender emotion, and you feel underneath this rather grim exterior that she presents, there is a heart screaming for sympathy. At the very end of that, the piece that I put together of Miss Wade, when she says, I would rather suffer so and plunge to the bottom of a river where I would still hold her after we both were dead. And the power of that, the contained feeling, and also the cunning of the prose, because you would normally say, we were both dead. We were both dead. No, he says, we both were dead. And that is a kind of knell, isn't it? A sort of death knell, like a bell tolling for the dead. We both were dead. I think it's extraordinary.
Something else and I love what you just said about Miss Wade, by the way. I mean, it's just, I've really learned something from your portrayal, from your own show, actually, things that I've missed. And I have to admit, I'd never quite joined the dots on Dickens and the significance of women at the age of 17, or I should say girls at the age of 17.
Of course, 17-year-old girls are beautiful, and men from time immemorial have fancied them. He was a very human, natural person. But the problem was that when they disappointed him, when they changed, as in the case of his wife, when she grew fat and tired, he felt venomous hatred towards her.
Yeah.
And that you cannot allow. So, of course, in his private life, he was awful. He was a bad man in his private life. Not in every aspect of it, because he was a good father, I think, a loving father. But he couldn't forgive women who disappointed him. And he was flawed. It's very human. I mean, who isn't flawed? No one's perfect. And he definitely wasn't perfect. But I felt such rage about him when I first heard what he'd done to his wife. You know, when he walled up the bedroom between them with a door and put books in it so that he was unable to be reached in his own house from his wife's bedroom.
I'm stunned by that as well. It's not what you expect. But I don't know if you remember in Bleak House, Miriam, the chapter titled Telescopic Philanthropy. And it's a long time since I've read the novel. But there's the lady who gives all that money to charity and works so hard for charity while her children are running around in rags.
Oh, yes, Mrs. Jellyby.
Right, that's it, Mrs. Jellyby. And it's the idea that you can be this most amazing saint-like figure to the wider world, but then at home, in your own domestic circumstances, you're not this great person always.
No, I mean, it's a truism, isn't it, that you're somebody who's very charitable to Africa and all your kids are starving at home. And I'm absolutely sure that was true. In fact, it was based on a real person. I forget who the person was, but there was a philanthropist who was like that. And many of his characters, I mean, one of my favourites, that's Mrs. Gamp, the drunken midwife, that she was based on a real person whom Dickens had observed. I think had attended his wife, and she was a bit of a drinker and talked, and he just recreated her for all time.
Yes. And you take from Mrs. Gamp a lifelong love of gin. Is that right?
Well, I think, to be honest, it was Mummy that got me started on gin.
I see.
She wanted me to not to suffer period pains.
Yes.
When I was menstruating. And so she said, we called it being poorly. And she said, when you're poorly, have some gin, it'll always make it better. And so she started me on that.
Yes. Well, and you speak very warmly about your parents in your book and how you were a fortress, the three of you, and how important that was for your confidence and your drive and, your sense of place in the world. Unlike Dickens, who, as you say, never forgave his mother, especially after the episode of the blacking factory. Something I find very interesting about you, Miriam, is, and you're known for Professor Sprout and the nurse, those sorts of characters, and yet you've played Mary Tyrone in Long Day's Journey into Night, that
was at Cambridge. That was when I was a student.
Yes,
and funnily enough, I was just saying yesterday I would love to play her again.
Yeah,
I'm a bit too old, but I am more of the right age for it.
Well, it's also that thing of kind of, you encompass so much. I mean, so often in your book, you declare yourself to be this kind of person, and yet you then always cross the pole. So a bit like when you're younger and you are naturally conservative politically because of your upbringing, and how you then go to Cambridge and that changes, but that you still understand where people are coming from and why they won't change their opinions there.
I think it's very important that we have to try to understand and relate to the people that we profoundly disagree with. Because if we don't, we're never getting anywhere. I mean, it could end in war. I went to America on one of the documentaries that I did, and I met people who were Trump supporters, and yet I knew that they were good people. And I think it's important that I remember that, because I hate all the things that Trump stands for, and I hate gun control. No, I mean, I love gun control.
Yes.
They just won't bring it in America. And I hate that. I hate the fact that people have guns and use them. But it's just vital that we cross the barriers that we set up. We have to.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a difficult time to do that, isn't it? Because it's sometimes seen as selling out in the public mindset, isn't it? Or if you make one statement, it's assumed that that statement is the complete knocking down of its opposite. That's interesting. As it's Christmas, I do wonder where the Christmas books of Dickens fit in your calendar, how you feel about A Christmas Carol and The Chimes, those books.
Well, of course, I had the luck to see you performing Christmas Carol. Was it in Edinburgh? Where did I see it?
It was
in Malton.
In Malton, yes.
In Malton. And it was transfixing and wonderful. And you're brilliant at it, really brilliant. It was superb. And that was delightful. And, you know, it's true. It is a wonderful piece of work. It's a wonderful piece of writing. It's a wonderful fairy tale. It's a morality tale. And it still has the power to shock and to enchant and to make you laugh and to make you cry. He was able to do all those things, and he did it in that little book, that little novella, and it's just an amazing achievement. Every time I read it, and I do read it quite a lot, I get something fresh from it. And I think that it should be read aloud to kids so that they're not just looking at Games of Thrones, but they're looking at something like that will open wider and more interesting doors.
Yes. And you're completely right about Dickens being read aloud. The reason I even know A Christmas Carol, even first started on my path to admiring Dickens, was I heard a very old radio drama adaptation of A Christmas Carol, which had Paul Scofield, who I think you've worked with,
yes,
and Ralph Richardson as Scrooge. Paul Scofield was the narrator. I don't know if you've ever heard that one, but it's a fantastic...
No, I haven't.
Oh, you would love it. You'd have a lot of old friends in there, I think. But yes. And
Where
thank
did you hear that? Where did you get it?
I had it on a cassette. I must find it. I must try and get the cassette and put it onto computer so I can send it to you as a file if you want.
I'd love to hear that. Paul was a wonderful actor, as obviously Ralph Richardson was, but I hadn't worked with Sir Ralph. But Paul Scofield I actually worked with in BBC, and I can remember very well that first morning when I went in. I got in there pretty early because I was nervous. I thought, I'm working with one of the great ones. And there was this rather shy, tall man in a corner of the studio when I came in. And I walked in and I said, oh, good morning. And he said, oh, hello, I'm Paul Scofield. And I just sort of fell to bits, really. And I loved him ever after.
Yes. Oh, that's so good to hear. It's so good to hear that he's on your good list, not your naughty list of people that you've met and worked with in the...
No, he's one of the saints.
Good. Do you have any desire to revive your Dickens and Women show or any future Dickens project for yourself?
It's interesting that you should say that, because just yesterday I was filming with Alan Yentob, who very flatteringly just chose me for one of his Imagine subjects for BBC. And I was talking in a group of my friends, Charlie Dance and Pat Hodge and Eileen Atkins and Alan Yentob. And Paul was saying that things, because I said I don't want it filmed. I don't want it filmed because it always diminishes something in the theatre if it's put on television. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, that these days is not necessarily true. And Patricia Hodge agreed and said, the technology is such now that you can have several cameras and you don't have to project it as if you are in the theatre. You can talk to the camera and it can work. And I've been thinking about that because I'm 80 and I'm not particularly mobile now. I've sort of stiffened up and my back is bad. So some of the physical aspects that I would want to employ in doing Dickens Women again would be hard for me. But if the camera comes to me and I can scale it to the camera, I think it's not impossible. I might not do all of them.
Yes.
I think I'd like to do some. I'm too good just to let it die.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That reminds me of the moment in your book, Miriam, where you go to the BBC and you say something along the lines of, I'm going to tell you how great I am right now, in your audition, and how you weren't in the business of hiding your light under a bushel, which I admire so much.
Well, you have to tell people how good you are because otherwise they might not know. So if you tell them, they'll pay attention. That's what I think.
Well, that's my New Year's resolution. I'm going to try and get better at that. But no, that would be very exciting if you get to do that and to film it. And of course, you talking about that Dickens Women show again, it's put in mind the fact that when you get to Miss Havisham, you say something incredibly interesting that I don't think I would ever have thought myself, is that you say that Miss Havisham is Dickens himself.
Yes, it occurred to me when Sonia and I were putting it together that the remarks he made, that Miss Havisham makes about love, are very much coming from someone who had been hurt in love. And I thought Great Expectations, it was one of the later books, and I just felt that it came out of his own personal experience, that there was an energy and a bite to her lines.
Well, the moment that made me think, that made me understand, I think, when you were saying Miss Havisham is Dickens, is that idea of the clock stopping at that time. And is it that Mary Hogarth's death is the moment for Dickens where his heart stops almost, perhaps?
Well, I don't think that he was in love with Mary Hogarth in other than a romantic way. I don't think it was a sexual passion with her, because she was too much of an angel. She was ethereal to him even before she died. I think that having been spurned by Maria Beadnell and made to feel small and irrelevant, I think that cut into his soul. And of course, he, as I say, he took his revenge on her when he put her into Little Dorrit as Flora Finching. And this little darting thing has become a fat and ridiculous old corpulent lady. And it's a marvellous portrait of that sort of person who keeps talking and still is coquettish and thinks that she can get him with a glance, with a toss of the curls. And actually it sickens him. So I think that there's a lot of his own pain. His pain is remembered. As I said in my Dickens Women, Dickens never got over anything that happened to him. And I think it's true. Every single thing, every hurt, every slight, every kiss, every moment of longing and anticipation and satisfaction, of jealousy, of pride, everything that happened to him, he remembered and he put it into his books. In some ways, he had the sensibility of a child, the pinprick that a child feels so acutely, which adults manage to mask over the years if they're pricked. He remembered it and felt it again as sharply and inescapably as he did the first time. And I think that's why his portrayals of children are so poignant and so accurate. I think Oliver Twist was the first time that a child had been the hero of a story. And then, of course, there was David Copperfield, who really was him. I mean, I think that was his favourite book.
Yes.
transpose the initials DC instead of CD. He never stopped being a child. He never stopped looking through into the world as a child. And little details, like when David Copperfield is ordering food and he sees in a pub and he sees the mirror, he reads the words as a mirror, as you do when you're looking on the wrong side of the door and you see, restaurant, bar, or whatever it is. And he writes that. He remembers what he felt like when he was a child. And not only does he never forget it, but he never forgets the feelings that he had. And they are the same feelings that he had as an adult.
And as you say about seeing through the eyes of a child, I think in David Copperfield, there's a moment that I remember where little David is sort of set down from a cart. He's sort of helped down and he's looked down upon from the adults. Is it Mrs. Micawber even? She looks down and he says something along the lines of, it was in that moment that he felt that she could see how young he was, but only in that moment. This amazing little boy who's sort of helping them out and doing all these extraordinary things. Yes. So, well, that's lovely, Miriam. That's fantastic, and I'm really excited to hear that let's say you are bringing back Dickens and Women, or at least a handful of them.
Well, it might be next year. It certainly can't be this year because I've got already too much work to do that. But next year, I really do think that it would be wonderful to revisit it.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it feels like we've almost come to an end, and I want to carry on. But this has been so illuminating and fun. Thank you so much. It's been brilliant. Are you going to be able to make it out to Italy for Christmas, or are you going to?
If the rules are unchanged by Wednesday,
yes,
I have a ticket, and I will take the tests and all the things you're supposed to do, and go out there. That's what I'm planning on.
Good. Well, I hope that comes across. I did have one question for you, which, if you have time, are there any particular Dickens adaptations that you love?
I thought that which book does Mr. Tulkinghorn come into?
Oh gosh, is that Bleak House?
I think it is. Yes. I love the BBC adaptation, and an unusual actress was cast as Lady Dedlock.
Yes.
Gillian Anderson.
Yes.
I thought she was wonderful, and I would never have expected her to be good, but she was wonderful. And Charles Dance as Mr. Tulkinghorn was absolutely magnificent. I think it was a very fine production.
Yes. And I think with that one, didn't they do it in serials? Each episode was a serial as it had been written by Dickens and put out himself.
Yes. He knew a thing or two, didn't he? He knew how to make a cliffhanger.
Yes, he did. Wow. Yes. Well, I completely agree with you. Yes, well, thank you ever so much again. It's been wonderful. And I have to say that part of my Christmas ritual will be to watch Blackadder's Christmas Carol again. I can't have a Christmas without that. You as Queen Victoria with Jim Broadbent as Albert. Did you ever see Jim Broadbent play Scrooge, by the way, when he was in?
No, I didn't.
I see. I'm interested in that because I can't imagine Jim Broadbent being Scrooge. I mean, I imagine
I can't imagine it.
His Scrooge must have been nice at the beginning and then just got nicer at the end. I mean, it just. Yes.
I think was it Alistair Sim who played Scrooge in an old film?
Yes, very famously.
I did love that. I did love that.
Yes, and George C. Scott, if you ever saw him, I thought he was very good. That was a later one that was quite dark.
It will go on and on being remade.
Yes.
It's never going to die because it is an absolutely brilliant book.
And it's its own genre, isn't it?
Yeah, completely.
It's a Wonderful Life comes from it. Many other great films come from it, don't they?
Yes, and it's honourable, it's moral.
Yes.
It's about people being kind to one another.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing for us all to hope for.
Yes. On that note, thank you so much, Miriam. It's been such a pleasure. I will end our chat now, but thank you for your time.
My pleasure too.